Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest.
Growing up in Chippewa Falls, I never could have imagined that I'd be taking on the richest man in the world.
April 3rd, 2025, the Democrats had a good day edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C., from New Haven, Connecticut, where she is the anchor of the New York Times Magazine and the anchor of Yale University Law School, Emily Bazelon.
Huh. That makes me feel a little worried about the anchors or the institutions, but go on.
Maybe you're an anchor, not in the sense that John is an anchor, but you're a drag on them.
Yeah, exactly.
And from New York City, where he is the co-anchor of the CBS Evening News and the anchor of CBS Evening News Plus, John Dickerson.
Hi, gang.
This week on the Gabfest, a Democrat wins a sweeping victory in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race and takes advantage of Elon Musk's unpopularity. Does that tell us anything about where Democrats now stand vis-a-vis Trump and politics? Then President Trump unveiled massive, nearly universal tariffs that promise to reshape the global economic and geopolitical order. Then we'll talk about the haphazard, slapdash way in which the Trump administration is identifying supposed gang members they're housing at a nightmare prison in El Salvador. Plus, we'll have cocktail chatter.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
The spirit of innovation is deeply ingrained in America, and Google is helping Americans innovate in ways both big and small. The Department of Defense is working with Google to help secure America's digital defense systems, from establishing cloud-based zero-trust solutions to deploying the latest AI technology. This is a new era of American innovation. Find out more at g.co/American innovation.
It was the biggest electoral showdown of the Trump presidency so far. The Wisconsin Supreme Court race. There's always one of these. The Wisconsin Supreme Court is hilarious. Like, you don't know anything. Like, was there ever a, Colorado Supreme Court race that you cared about? But every few weeks, it seems, there's a Wisconsin Supreme Court race that is the most important political campaign of the season. This race pitting a liberal-leaning would-be Justice Susan Crawford against a conservative-leaning would-be Justice Brad Schimmel drew $100 million in spending, much of it from infuriated, enraged liberals, and even more of it from Elon Musk, who I would say literally tried to buy the election for Schimmel. So coupled with better than expected Democratic performance in two House races in Florida, the flipping of a Republican-held state Senate seat recently in Pennsylvania, Democrats are feeling slightly less terrible about their electoral prospects because Crawford won so easily. So, John, you can overread election results in all kinds of ways. You could read...
I've made a career of it.
I know. That's why I'm going to you first. You could read it, this Crawford's win, as a rebuke against Trump, a rebuke against Musk, just liberal rage, channeled in the only direction it can be channeled, the usual pendulum shift of an off-year election, the growing trend of Democrats voting more consistently than Republicans and thus showing up for an off-year election. How are you going to overread this one, John?
I think I'm going to here's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to overread it by underreading it, which is its own misapplication of experience, which is to say, I think Elon Musk is a drag and is toxic in politics. And so I think there seems to be sufficient reporting, and the 10-point victory by Crawford over Schimmel in the Wisconsin judiciary race does seem to suggest that he did not help. And his unpopularity in the polls nationally and other ways would suggest that he is now an electoral drag. And I think it's a pretty solid case for that. But in Florida 6, it's a plus 30 Trump district. The Republican won by 14 points. Florida 1 is a plus 37 Trump district. Republican won by 14 points. The difference between those two, you can probably chalk up to those forces you mentioned, David, but I wouldn't. It's better news for Democrats than, say, if it trended closer to the general election. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to say a little Trump backlash, plus the fact that Republicans don't get as enthusiastic about non-Trump candidates, which is something we did know as they do Donald Trump, is all explained by that. So there's not some new thing here for Democrats. I think one thing I would add to your week is that, and this is different, I don't think Democrats necessarily got a message or have something to see in these results that's going to give them nourishment going forward. I think Cory Booker, perhaps giving the longest speech in the Senate, don't dare call it a filibuster, is an interesting gambit in this sense, which is that he tried to give an affirmative case for, and tying it to the history of civil rights in America, an affirmative case for the Democratic project. And there's a lot of that argument going on. And I think that is what I think a party that seeks to be dominant again someday needs. In other words, it can't just be anti-Trump. It can't just be the pendulum. It's got to be, let's rush out of our chairs in support of this set of ideas. And whether you heard it in Cory Booker's speech or not, he made a go at it. And I think that's probably something that happened this week that has a long-term possible thing we might be talking about someday.
Yeah, I mean, that was the first speech of Cory Booker's presidential campaign, I'm sure. That's it. I should have included that, of course, John. So, Emily, let's linger on Musk for a second. The lingering Musk.
Available at your perfumer's counter.
It is definitely a perfume that you bought for a girl back in 1988.
Next Saturday Night Live ad, right?
Lingering Musk. So Musk's efforts were heavy-handed, even by Musk standards. He gave $1 million to two people. He was giving out $100 payments to people who signed petitions. Didn't appear that is illegal. In fact, this Wisconsin Supreme Court, which has a Democratic majority, did not find it illegal, at least didn't stop him from doing it. But God, it stinks. And the other part about it, which is I'm like, as somebody who wants Musk to fail, I was really gratified to see him engage so heavily, because it cannot possibly be beneficial for him to be just so blatantly corrupt and attempting to buy an election. That can't possibly delight voters in Wisconsin broadly, even if it gets some people to sign petitions and get checks.
Right. And it was fascinating that he seemed to have no clue about that, when it seemed so obvious to anyone else that nobody really wants a weird, unpopular billionaire to show up and literally publicly try to write huge checks to people to go vote the way he says. So I guess that's a sort of insight into his character. I mean, I think another thing about this election is that it signals something about elections that don't have the kind of turnout that a presidential election has, right? I mean, there was high turnout compared to other special elections in Wisconsin, but it was low turnout compared to 2024. And maybe that augurs something about 26, which is also an off-year election. But there's just this pattern emerging here where it's actually better for Democrats when fewer people vote. Not actually the way that Democrats like to think about themselves, or the way that they think about voting rights, which they try to make broader. And one could argue, and I think I would, that that's a good principle, regardless of the partisan consequences. But I think that's part of the equation here. So, this could make a difference looking ahead to Virginia, which is the next off-year election, right? But yeah, I think that you're right that the Cory Booker speech and this question of messaging is the thing that matters, looking 4 years ahead.
I would toss in also what we're going to talk about with respect to tariffs in terms of electoral earthquake making events. That, if the economists are right and what Donald Trump has done, it destroys the economy, and particularly for people who were in his base, even though he's saying he's going to help them, that ends up being a long-lasting economic problem that happened this week for Republicans, and that help Democrats. Do either of you have any wisdom about, and or does it matter? There was this voter ID law that was put into the state constitution in Wisconsin, which is a win for Republicans. It was already on the books and had been for a decade. So this just puts it in the state constitution. But I just wondered, that's about the limit of my knowledge, whether there's anything interesting about that in a state where obviously the liberal beat the conservative handily.
I think that it's an interesting indication that in Wisconsin, at least, voter ID is popular. The majority of people want it. I think there's something common sense feeling about it. It has actually turned out not to be the barrier to people voting that a lot of liberal advocates thought it was going to be when the fight started over voter ID. It turns out that, like, most people have it and can sort it out. And as you said, it's not going to actually change the practice in Wisconsin because they've had it for 10 years. And so apparently people have gotten used to it and don't feel terrible about it. It's not to say there are no costs or no disproportionate effect, I think, especially on elderly, low-income people. But interesting that they're keeping it.
Emily or John, maybe, just as a political matter, does this reflect, it could just reflect the good people of Wisconsin thinking, do we want voter ID? I would like to have voter ID. It seems sensible. Or it could be strategic voting, which is Democrats starting to realize, we backed the wrong horse when we were trying to expand the franchise to everyone and make it very easy to vote. Let us get behind the voting limits. And it's this moment where, in 4 years, Republicans will be arguing to make it, you can vote from your phone. You can vote 12 times if you need to. And Democrats will be like, the only people who can vote are people who show a passport and, own property.
Sure, exactly. And have read
read all of the Federalist Papers, number 1 to 106.
Yeah, it's I don't know if if there's evidence that that's the case in Wisconsin, or whether there's just sort of split ticket voting because clearly it seems like some number of people in Wisconsin voted for the Democrat and then also backed the voter ID measure. Whether that's just the split ticket voting that happens as a result of sort of, as Emily said, sort of it seems common sense, or whether people did it in that more calculated way. But drawing a conclusion on that doesn't undermine your overall question, David, which is quite interesting. But I would add then in the mix there, whether in the next major election, so the next presidential, or I think even the next off year, the effect that Donald Trump has had on his electorate does that, and we'll talk about this probably every week for the rest of the next 6 years. Does that rallying effect happen when it's other Republicans? So in other words, it used to be the Democratic line. The more people vote, the better it is for Democrats. That wasn't true with Donald Trump. Will that not be true with next GOP nominee TK or Senator, Jojo Bean from state whatever in the off year? Really interesting thing to watch.
Yeah. There was an op-ed in today's New York Times by Republican pollster Kristen Soltis Anderson saying that the interesting thing that she feels in the Wisconsin result in particular was just the amount of rage, and that rage is such a motivator for people voting, that rage is in a way a better motivator than joy is, and opportunity and hope in some sense. And that what she notes, and you see this in the kind of infuriated town halls for the few Republicans who are willing to hold a town hall, the infuriated town halls, you see it in the voting around Wisconsin, just Democrats who don't necessarily have a kind of plan, but they have a lot of anger. And that reminded her, at least, of what we saw in 2010 with the rise of the Tea Party, what we saw a little bit in 2018 in the first Trump midterm. So, Emily, do you sense that Democratic anger, even if it's inchoate, even if it doesn't identify itself around a set of clear issues, is their most potent weapon?
Yeah, I think so. I hope that there's more to it, but right. It just feels like the base, at least, is furious and feels very frustrated at not having enough outlets to express that fury. And here came one, and then it had Elon Musk's face all over it for reasons that are apparent only to Elon Musk.
Do you think, John, that Musk continues to be valuable to Trump because he is taking on some of the uglier parts and some of the uglier work is being absorbed by him, or that at some point Musk becomes a weight on Trump's back and it would be better to separate himself? And is there any sign? I saw that Tesla's stock price was up, and some people are hypothesizing it's because Trump is telling people that Musk is soon going to be working less on Doge and thus being back to running Tesla.
Right.
Like, do you get a sense of A, whether that is actually happening, and B, whether Musk, broadly speaking, helps or hurts Trump?
Needs Musk. I don't know. I mean, I think in general, he still helps Trump and helps Trump in a way that's consistent with Trump's worldview. And two things come to mind when I say that. One is he is as Amanda Ripley would say, a chaos entrepreneur, and Trump loves chaos. And while he prefers to be the author of the chaos, because as the author, he is then the recipient of the fealty paid to the person that you want to stop doing the chaos for whatever your particular interest is. So that you can see that in the trade war that he's unleashed. But I think when Musk unleashes chaos, Trump then is still at the center of the post-chaos world, and so that I think is okay with him. I think also Musk does good work for Trump on Twitter, and Trump sees the world as in that way as well. So I think whether he's in or out of the actual old executive office building, I think Trump still benefits from Musk in a big way, and would not want him kind of on the other side of him. But there are these reports that he's leaving, and he's got to deal. Tesla is. It's got issues, and also he's trying, as my colleague Kelly O'Grady was reporting last night. Musk has got ambitions for Tesla that are beyond cars. They are part of his massive ambition to change it into this much larger kind of entity. So I think it's possible to make a case that he would want to leave. This has been a fun sidelight. And he'll keep meddling in politics, but he's got other bigger, grander ambitions about changing the way, economic flows take place and his missions to Mars and all that. So I could see him moving on just as he gets more interested in some other thing.
Finally, on this, I would just like to throw to you, Ms. Bazelon Esquire. It is so depressing to see $100 million go into a race for a Supreme Court justice in a state. That is just ridiculous. I mean, it's absurd that we elect Supreme Court justices and for this much money to go in for something like this.
Yeah, I mean, it is a crazy amount of money. There are obviously plenty of states that appoint justices and state judges. I think personally that the best way of doing this is to have some kind of expert committee that advises the governor so that you're making it one layer removed from politics in some way. And you have a bipartisan group that comes from the state bar and retired judges and other people who hopefully are going to kind of steer toward really highly qualified candidates and keep this to be a kind of more professional sort of contest is the wrong word, but selection process. And what we see instead are these elections that are verging more and more into all out partisan fights, which, makes it clear to the voters what's at stake. You know what you're getting. On the other hand, it's really not how we like to think about the judiciary as having some kind of semblance of separation of law from politics.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Home Chef. Do you find yourself eating the same thing over and over again and in need of inspiration? Home Chef is here to make searching for new meals and cooking a new dish something to look forward to. I have been cooking with my son Gideon on Home Chef recently. It's so fun. We have a great time doing it together. He's learning a lot about cooking. And it's also brought us some dishes and some flavors that we wouldn't have ever had otherwise. So the other night he made honey cashew shrimp with broccoli fried rice. Never would have thought to put honey and cashews and shrimp together. It was delicious. A few weeks ago, we did garlic ginger tofu tacos with teriyaki glaze and pineapple salsa. Again, that's something that I maybe have had a version of at a restaurant at some point, but to do it at home was really fun. It was really healthy. We absolutely demolished both those meals, and we had a great time doing it. Home Chef has everything you and your family need for hassle-free, delicious dinners. And with over 30 options a week, they cater to a variety of dietary needs. And that's why users of leading meal kits have rated Home Chef #1 in quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. So let Home Chef deliver fresh ingredients and chef-designed recipes conveniently to your doorstep to simplify your cooking. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering Gabfest listeners 50% off and free shipping for your first box, plus free dessert for life. Go to homechef.com/Gabfest. That's homechef.com/Gabfest for 50% off your first box and free dessert for life. homechef.com/Gabfest. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert.
This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. I really need new pajamas or a new nightgown, just some sleepwear that works better for me than the raggedy tank tops and old pajamas that I've been wearing. So I went on the Saks website and found a whole bunch of lovely things in nice light materials, silk, satin, cotton, all kinds of different two-piece sets that I could imagine happily wearing, lovely bathrobes. There's something really pretty from a designer called Notori that looked really nice, and something else from another designer called Eberjay that I'd never heard of. These are the kinds of things that you can easily find if you go online and shop at Saks. So if you're looking for a fun, effortless shopping experience and want to elevate your personal style, head to Saks. That's Saks.com for everyday inspiration.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by BetterHelp. Let's talk numbers. Traditional in-person therapy can cost anywhere from $100 to $250 per session, which adds up fast. But with BetterHelp Online Therapy, you can save, on average, up to 50% per session. With BetterHelp, you pay a flat fee for weekly sessions, saving you big on cost and time. Because therapy should feel accessible, not like a luxury. And with online therapy, you get quality care at a price that makes sense and can help you with anything from anxiety to everyday stress. Your mental health is worth it, and now it's within reach. With over 30,000 therapists, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. It's convenient, too, because you can join a session with a click of a button, helping you fit therapy into your busy life. And you can switch therapists at any time. Your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com/Gabfest today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gabfest. On Wednesday afternoon, just after the markets closed, President Trump held his long-awaited Liberation Day ceremony in the Rose Garden. He announced the most sweeping American tariffs in more than a century. They're complicated, and I'm sure I'm going to get some of the details wrong. Basically, 10% on almost all foreign goods, a 10% tariff on almost all foreign goods coming to the U.S. Those will go into effect on Saturday, April 5th. An additional reciprocal tariffs on most of our major trading partners. So another 26% additionally on China, another 10% additionally on the EU, another 14% on Japan, another 16% on India, and so on and so on. He did exempt Mexico and Canada for most of the tariffs, I think recognizing how important the integrated supply chains of North America have become and how disruptive that would be to put more strain on them. But Trump claims that these tariffs are largely tit for tat. They're reciprocal. They're based on tariffs and other trade barriers imposed by other countries on U.S. goods. And he says he's taking this action basically to his claim is that it will induce businesses to bring back key industries to the U.S., and it punishes trading partners that he says are taking advantage of the United States. How it is taking advantage of the United States by selling us cars and cheese and computers that we want at prices that we want to pay is unclear to me, but that is his position. So, John, what do economists believe the effects of these tariffs will be on top of all the other tariffs that Trump has also laid out? Auto tariffs that went into effect today, for example.
Oof. Yeah. Okay. The first thing is that tariffs are taxed, so it's because they would see an increase in prices for Americans, and Americans have already. We've seen the consumer confidence numbers drop in the last 4 months, and when consumers are interviewed about what their concerns are, they're fearful about prices increasing as a result of tariffs. So you have a two-part problem with prices increasing as a result of the import tax paid. One is that the prices actually go up. The second is that consumers think the prices are going to go up, so they pull in their spending patterns. We already know that people are really at the margin. Even now, it used to be people, the super wealthy were not at the margin. They were spending, but everybody else was really at the margin. And I think I've mentioned this before, but even in tiny little ways, like buying little nip bottles at the liquor store instead of buying a fifth, buying one package of cigarettes at the convenience store instead of a carton. Walmart saying that people are running out of money at the end of the month. Dollar General saying the version of the same thing. So that was the existing environment. Now you have greater strain on people, including now even there's some reports at the top end. So that's just one of the immediate challenges to the economic conditions. The way in which the president has behaved on again, off again, loudly proclaiming ideas that have no support in the economic or business world about tariffs and the way they work creates a level of uncertainty that we've seen in both the CEO confidence numbers and then again this week in the small business owners confidence numbers, which is essentially how the hell do I make decisions in this environment? And then specifically with respect to tariffs, how do I make a decision about this component part that I've got when the tariff might change? Do I go find a whole new supplier in a whole new country that might have a lower tariff? Do I do it in the United States? What if there isn't such a supplier? Oh my God, how am I going to work this out? Oh, by the way, I've got to deal with my labor costs and I've got to deal with all these other things. So it creates friction in the system. Those are some of the problems. And then just finally, in the nirvana that this is supposed to deliver, which is to say a manufacturing renaissance in America, there are some barriers to that within the tariff itself. Manufacturing is done in a lot of cases with component parts that come from these places. Those component parts are now going to be more expensive. Consumers have to buy the goods that you manufacture in the United States. And if the consumers are worried about price increases, they may not buy those manufactured goods. The upside, of course, as Trump argues, is that there will be an increase in purchases of American-made goods that will cause American manufacturers to hire more people, although unemployment is still pretty low. And then we would expect in the future, and these are long-term benefits, which is one of the challenges here, short-term pain versus maybe long-term benefit, is that you have plants and equipment that get purchased or built, and then you have to train a workforce for them. And so you would see economic activity flowing in that direction. That's the argument. But, as I've said, economists are skeptical that would happen.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me like Trump was elected to lower prices and now prices are going to go up. And that's like exactly the opposite. And then there's just the way in which the United States relationship to free trade around the world seems totally affected.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they're calling these reciprocal tariffs, like you said, David, but actually it seems really obvious from the numbers that they released that they just took the trade deficit that we have with a particular country and then divided it by the country's exports. So it's just like we're buying more from them than they are from us. And that's bad, with no sense of like what you said, which is we want the cheese and computers, et cetera. I should say that our friend Jim Surowicki was the one who came up with that quickly last night. And it seems really obvious, even as the Trump folks deny it. And then it also just seems like we're harking back to this economy of the 1950s that we don't have a path back to. And even if we did, it would benefit a small number of people who would go work at factories, which are mostly automated now anyway. And the cost is to everybody else, mostly, right? Like middle and low income people who pay a higher share of their income for goods to begin with. And so they're the ones who the prices are going to hit higher. It just seems like madness.
So it's depicted as an economic act, and it's an act of economic aggression and to create an economic benefit to the United States in theory. But it is also a geopolitical act. And when you think about the foundation of the world for our entire lifetime is this network of alliances with Europe, Japan, Korea, Canada, Latin America, that has made the United States, the strongest country for a generation. And by unilaterally imposing these tariffs and also treating these allies with such derision and such scorn, you also break these geopolitical relationships that have been critical. And I think there's a perfectly reasonable case to be made that we've gotten into a lot of trouble by allowing China to become the dominant maker of so many goods that are worldly important. That the fact that China makes such a high percentage of the ships in the world, such a high percentage of the chips in the world, such a high percentage of new cars now, such a high percentage of so many goods that are critical to the world, and that China is the sole or dominant producer of them is a problem. But the way you counter that, in my view, and I think in the eyes of most economists, is not by imposing world tariffs. It's by building up an interconnected economic web that is a tight alliance so that United States doesn't have to become the dominant ship manufacturer, but it does have to work with the Netherlands and England and Korea to collectively be, a counterweight in ship manufacturing. And by fragmenting these alliances into kind of small shards, it makes it less likely for us to be able to compete globally with the Chinese. The Chinese have all this strength, but our strength was these alliances and the ability of this interconnected web of countries to work together to be a counterweight, so that collectively, the Dutch made these chip etching machines that are essential for high-end chip manufacturing, and the Apple, the engineers in Silicon Valley designed these chips, but now it's all broken, and that seems terrible.
Well, what you're describing is like win-win, right? You're describing everybody benefits, and Trump only believes in a zero-sum game in which America's getting ripped off. And if we can squeeze a little bit more out of these other countries, then it doesn't matter that the pie is growing or that we're the richest. It just matters that maybe we could get a little bit of a better deal.
The Apple does seem to me to be in a particular challenge, which is that they 15 to 20% of their sales take place in China. So now, to the extent that China retaliates to this 54 to 6 or 60% tariff, depending on how you do the math, that's going to hurt Apple's ability to sell iPhones in China. But also secondarily, those iPhones are made in China. So all those component part costs that we were talking about earlier are going to give it a sock in the tummy. Can I add one other point that I thought made really good sense? Andrew Studiford at the National Review pointed out what it seems exactly right, which is that this is a gift to those who are running the government and those who benefit from the selling and trading of favors. Because the way this works out is individual companies will come to Trump or to members of Congress and say, can you get us a loophole here or get us out of this? And individual countries will all come running to try to find a way to work their way out of this. It really centralizes economic activity in the policy in Washington in a way I think that's increased, or that feels like it's going to be quite increased. So the lobbyists are probably quite happy, I should think.
Yeah, John, I was just thinking about this yesterday in a different context, because Politico confirmed that the ugly house I was talking about the other day was bought by Mark Zuckerberg. That means that Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Peter Thiel, a whole bunch of other billionaires that I've vaguely heard of now have homes in Washington, D.C. This is completely out of whack from how the United States has traditionally worked. Traditionally, billionaire class does not bother to actually be present in Washington, D.C. They'll show up for some event once in a while, a Kennedy Center honor or something like that. But they're not living here. They're not being habitués. They're not being part of the social center. But that's what happens at courts. That's what happens at imperial governments, where the richest people, because they're rent seekers and they're there to get benefits out of the government. It's exactly what you're talking about. They are here. They are physically present because they know if they show themselves at the Trump White House, they can get exemptions and benefits that are unfair.
That if you're not there, you might not get.
Can I think that has the ring of truth, but also probably it's true that the super wealthy are now so super wealthy that it connects to your earlier point, David, which is that a $24 million house ain't what it used to be.
Yes.
So it's it's not, what the hell? Yeah. This is whatever's the category right about pocket change.
Yeah, that's totally true. The other point about, the point I forgot to make about these, when you break these alliances, and you sort of turn Japan into a trading opponent as opposed to a partner, you just make global conflict much more likely. Trading partners don't fight each other in general. Trading partners do a pretty good job of not fighting each other. And the more integrated your web of trading is, the less likely you are to end up in a hot war with anybody. And I just do not like a world in which everyone is an adversary to the United States. That seems to me like to be a really bad world to be in.
I do want to just repeat something I said before, which I wonder about, which is, if you look at the Economist, you can imagine how the Economist responded to this. It's a chorus of people running their nails down a blackboard to the Economist. So it delivered a review that reflects that. And in that review, it said, it's hard to know which is more unsettling, that the leader of the free world could spout complete drivel about its most successful and admired economy, or the fact that on April 2nd, spurred on by his delusions, Donald Trump announced the biggest break in America's trade policy in over a century and committed the most profound, harmful, and unnecessary economic error in the modern era. Okay. This is a consensus view, even though some Republicans might not say it. I just wonder, yes, there's always talk about how Donald Trump does things that deviate from the norms, but this is now an extra new special level, and he will continue to say things out loud that to a greater number of ears in foreign capitals and in boardrooms and so forth will sound like complete insanity. Different, I think what I'm wondering is this a new category, and does that have its own kind of turbulence that it creates, whether it's uncertainty in purchasing decisions or in those alliances you were talking about, David, that there is a special kind of Trump turbulence tax that will be applied to both geopolitical relationships, but then also the global economy, based on the notion that he really has gone all chips in on a theory that has such universal opposition to it.
I mean, do you mean that as a tax and as a good thing or a bad thing? Like, is that because, one of the theories is that Trump, the madman, benefits the United States because everybody then gets wary of him and tiptoes around and gives us things we wouldn't get otherwise. And another is that it's just profoundly destabilizing and bad, and they're going to get fed up with us.
Yes. Well, and then there's a third, which is this is all a negotiating tactic. The problem with it's all a negotiating tactic is you can't, on the one hand, say these are temporary bluffs meant to bring countries to heel, but then they're also going to give us $700 billion a year to finance the income tax cut. They can't be both. They can't be a permanent revenue stream and a bluff. But that's different than the question you're asking. It's a great one, Emily. The crazy man theory has been a real thing in history, and I think also with Trump it exists. I mean, he got lots of leaders of foreign countries to come rushing to the United States to say, "What can I do to please you?" Which is a success. Which is a success of his theory. I think in this case, my question more accurately framed is, has he gone too far? And will countries now, you saw China talking to South Korea and Japan to try to find alternative trade routes to their relationship with the United States. Will he drive countries to make the kinds of decisions that Europeans are now making about their security post Oval Office meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, decisions that recognize a kind of permanent snap? And what are the implications of that? And then a counter to that would be, doesn't matter. The United States economy is gargantuan. There can be no permanent snap, and this will all work out for Trump somehow. But I just wonder, this is a new level of going it alone and risk taking for Trump, and does that create a new condition that we haven't seen before?
I mean, I was going to ask you guys how you think other countries will react, because I feel myself super uncertain. But one possibility is they do both. They both show up and try to, offer minor concessions the way Canada and Mexico did. And they see if this is a bluff. But at the same time, they start making the kinds of plans you're talking about to realign. Mm-hmm. Because the tariffs like this could come back at any time. And also because this suggests that we're just not reliable in some way that will have these longer term downstream effects, right? I mean, you could see I think that if I was a leader of one of these countries, God forbid, that's what I would do, right? You would sort of hope you could scurry back in, but at the same time, start making the moves that, create more independence, because you just don't know. I mean, there's this 4 years, there's who are the Americans going to elect next? Like, we just seem different than we were before.
Right.
Which country would you be president of, Emily?
Oh my God. Can you imagine? What unlucky country. I don't want to wish myself on any on any small nation. Although there's some good jokes about those uninhabited islands with tariffs where there are only penguins. Maybe the penguins would like me to elect that. Me as
President Penguin?
Oh yeah, I could be the president of the Penguins.
Today's episode is sponsored by Smart Travel, a new podcast from NerdWallet. Want to travel like a savvy jet setter? That doesn't mean monogramming your passport. It means making smart decisions every step of your trip, which means knowing your options. Smart Travel unpacks the facts, like which booking sites actually save money, how to fly first class using points, and if that fancy travel card is a smart investment. Also, you can save more on your next adventure. Stay tuned at the end of the episode to hear the Smart Travel trailer. And be sure to follow Smart Travel from NerdWallet so you can start traveling like a pro. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Up First. If you're constantly doom scrolling on Facebook or X or TikTok, you might need a break from news fatigue. And Up First can free you from that all-day scroll and tell you everything you need to know in an easy 15 minutes. NPR's Up First provides the top 3 news stories to start your day in digestible 10 to 15 minute episodes. It's basically all the news you need so you can get back to your day feeling informed and preserving your sanity. From the Trump administration to business and the economy to immigration policies, Up First is the daily go-to habit for news consumers who want to stay informed but are forever strapped for time. Up First short format makes it easy to catch up on what's happening while you're making breakfast or getting ready for work. And it provides the 1-2 punch of being both short and thorough, national and international, fact-based and personal. So with Up First, you can start your day a little more in the know than when you went to sleep. Listen now to the Up First podcast from NPR. ICE and other agencies of the United States and of DHS have been aggressively targeting Central and South Americans in the United States for expulsion. A group of hundreds of people were rounded up, put on planes to El Salvador, where they're being held at U.S. expense at a fearsome Salvadoran prison under claims that they are gang members of Tren de Aragua and MS-13. This week, that, of course, created a huge controversy because a judge here in D.C. attempted to stop that expulsion and failed because the Trump administration appears to have ignored a court order that he issued, or certainly danced around a court order that he issued trying to stop the expulsion. This week has come multiple stories of people who appear to have been rounded up and imprisoned on the basis of the flimsiest possible evidence, and in one case in direct contravention of a judicial order. So I want to talk about, they feel like they're two separate strands of this, or not separate, two related strands. One is the slapdash and casual standards the Trump administration is using to identify people as gang members. That's one. And the second piece is the refusal to correct obvious mistakes that they've made, which is two. So to start with the refusal to correct obvious mistakes, Emily, let's talk about the really tragic case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who's a Salvadorian living in Maryland, who, with an explicit judicial ruling that he had a right to be here and that he should not be expelled from the country, he was rounded up and imprisoned in this prison in El Salvador. The Trump administration has admitted, which they never do, they admitted an administrative error in sending him there, but they say they can't do anything about it because he's no longer in their custody. Oopsie. I mean, there are all kinds of questions here, but goodness, just I hand you the outrage pen.
the outrage wand.
This is setting my hair on fire. Obviously, they can do something about it for 8 million reasons, one of which is like the president of El Salvador, who's taking these detainees, is doing it to curry favor. Of course, they would give this person back, along with all the other people who had zero due process before they got deported into this prison. And it's just, it's honestly incredible to have the United States government be taking this position. I don't really know what else to say, except that we've gone into some dark place here of treating human beings as if, because I don't know what, they weren't born here, so they just we don't care about them whatsoever. I'm not really sure what else to conclude.
So yeah, it can't, so basically they're saying we can kidnap people from the United States who have a right to be here. We can pay for them to be imprisoned in another country, and then say, oh, we can't do anything about it because it would, their claim, the Trump administration's claim about why they can't do anything about it is he's no longer in our custody, even though we're paying for him to be in custody elsewhere. And it would disrupt broader U.S. foreign policy interests to do this. And it's just, it's incredible. It's astonishing.
Yeah, And bad. Astonishing and bad, right? Because this cannot be the way. I mean, if you can snatch anybody up off the street by mistake and then refuse to go get them back, then that truly can be anybody, right? Like, it could be someone today who's this particular guy from El Salvador, but if they can't correct any mistakes, then that in the end could, in theory, apply to every person. And even if you don't want to go that far, even if you only want to imagine that this is true of immigrants, it's still breathtaking.
They also are claiming things that for which there is no evidence. J.D. Vance saying that Abreu Garcia was convicted, which he was not.
Was not, right. There were these allegations that he was in a gang that were not substantiated, that the cops didn't believe.
Yeah. I mean, the other aspect of this, which is so unsettling, which is I can imagine if they had deported Abreu Garcia to El Salvador somewhere and he was at liberty in that country. And you would say, well, he's at liberty. He can now go through a process to apply to come back in. They put him in a gulag. Like he's not even making this claim himself. He is unable to communicate. He is like being held in this nightmare prison. He's a man who's convicted of nothing, who has the right to be in the United States, who has no business being in this prison. And their view is no, it is an unfixable problem. And I just think it's beyond anything I could contemplate, but whatever. There's also this other question that has come up, which is the standards that they are applying, the U.S. government is applying to determine who is a gang member who should be eligible for this quick and harsh expulsion. And the ACLU has litigated around this, and they've learned some of these standards, which are extraordinarily broad. It is not, you don't have to have been arrested for gang activity. You don't have to be convicted of anything. Having tattoos, which are associated with the gang. I use that word extremely loosely, that word associated.
Allegedly associated. Yes.
Is enough to get you well on the way to being put in the Salvadoran prison. So just having a Michael Jordan tattoo, having a Real Madrid tattoo of a crown, having the phrase "real until I die" tattooed, which is a very popular reggaeton phrase, wearing, streetwear, which people do, is enough to pile up points, these points that get you on the list to be identified as a Tren de Aragua gang member, and thus deservedly sent to a prison from which there is no recourse, from which you are there for who knows how long, and with you're in a living hell. So what do you make, John, of this lack of due process that these gang members are being afforded? And I use the phrase gang members in air quotes.
Yeah, well, it's what James Boasberg was originally concerned about, the judge who asked the Trump administration to just hang on a minute before these people that you had already arrested and had contained. In other words, they weren't roaming the streets freely. Before you go sending them off on planes in the dark of night with no due process at all, and based on a questionable interpretation of a law that you think that removes the due process obligation from you. This is the heart of what he's been trying to do, is just get them to explain their process and whether the due process that's afforded any person in the United States. So that's still an ongoing fight. And basically the White House, to me, you can imagine the White House trying to do this and getting caught and then backing down. They have refused to. I mean, they continue to go forward. They don't continue to use the Alien Enemies Act at the moment, but they're not supplying the judge with information. One would imagine that because in other instances where judges have asked for proof of claims, they've either come up with none or they've lied and the judges have caught them. I'm thinking particularly about probationary employees where the White House or the administration claimed these people were fired for cause, and then it was obvious that there were no examinations of their records, and there were in fact evidence to the contrary, that people had been praised for the work they'd done, but then were fired for cause. So a lot of judges have said, wait a minute, the evidence you're saying that you have is either made up or doesn't exist. So you could imagine that happening in this case. And we've, of course, seen at least 3 or 4 cases where people who've been sent to Secot in El Salvador appear to have no evidence at all. So I guess this gets us back to our court question, and whether ultimately this will be a question of whether the United States. I don't know what, Emily, what happens next. Like, does Boasberg? I mean, what's the ultimate conclusion of the back and forth with Boasberg? Is it that people get returned from El Salvador, or what?
Well, that would be a good resolution. We're not there yet, right? Now the government is asserting that they can't answer questions because of national security, which is this like very broad kind of hole that they can create in the record of the litigation. But we did have the DC Circuit, the appellate court, back up Boasberg so far. So, all of that is going to continue to play out, both in terms of how the Trump administration can proceed going forward, and then also what happens to these actual human beings who we have put in El Salvador in this prison. It doesn't feel to me like this is about mere carelessness. I mean, obviously that is true, and that is really important to recognize because we're talking about people's lives, and there just seems to be incredible disregard for that. But I think also the Trump administration doesn't care because they're just trying to send a message to everybody: don't come, leave.
Yeah.
Like, things are so bad. I mean, this is self-deportation. This is the acting out in this very draconian way of this threat, this idea that the only way to really limit illegal immigration to this country is to make things so unpleasant and dire that people just don't want to come, or they pick up and go. So the threat, the arbitrariness, the fear, the scariness, like the terror, all of it is on purpose.
Yes, agree. And also, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And there's this other element, which is that anyone who stands up and says, why are you doing this? They immediately accuse of being apologists for the gang members.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, you support gang members. And so it's also making it not just unpleasant to be someone who's here, who's undocumented, but also very unpleasant to be an ally. And so that just it minimizes any discussion of it. And that's, it's been pretty effective. I would feel quite differently about all of this, I think, if there wasn't a prison involved. I think the United States, look, I think the way they're pursuing these policies is wrong. I think people who come to this country, even if they come to this country not under legal channels, have certain due process rights. You should not disrupt people's lives casually and cruelly and with terror. Like, I agree with all of that. But I think that there's a distinction between, like, we are deporting you. You don't have a right to be here. We're deporting you to your home country. Sorry. To we're putting you in a prison from which you cannot speak, and you're being effectively tortured.
Indefinitely.
Indefinitely. Like, those two things are different. And that one really, 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 really makes me think back to the true terror regimes of the world. I mean, you see people say gulag. You say there's this conservative Cato Institute immigration scholar who had this incredible quote about why it's so bad that we're depriving people of due process. We're doing something extraordinary here for the government to sentence people to what's essentially slave labor, torture, prison in El Salvador based on nothing, based on having a flower tattoo. And I hearken back to, like, this is like a kind of ballooned version of a little bit of what we did in the early days of the War on Terror, where we scooped up lots of people, and lots of people ended up in Guantanamo, and people ended up, some people ended up tortured, and some people ended up for years and years and years in Guantanamo. And it was an immoral and terrible act. It was an immoral and terrible act in a genuine moment of war and uncertainty. To do this at a moment, to declare a war that doesn't exist, to declare a kind of mortal threat to the country that doesn't exist. I mean, I talk to people who are in Aurora, Colorado. It's a nice place to be. Like, Aurora, Colorado is not a war zone. Yeah. And it's just wrong. It's wrong. I have no more words.
When you talk about the power of the message this sends for self-deportation, which is to say the theatricality of it and the shaved heads and Secot and all of the messaging that's going to tell people, don't dare come here, and if you're here, you might as well just get out of here. that doesn't happen in clean, narrow boundaries, which is to say that when one wonders what the effects will be of seeing that, which is to say a person can just be disappeared into a place, when that becomes a kind of way you can treat another human being, what do other people who are looking for opportunities to do as they please take from that as they treat other human beings? Does this have no effect? Particularly the response to the revelation that Abreu Garcia was wrongfully sent away, which has been kind of totally disinterested or sorry, we can't do anything. That surely must send a message that will have repercussions.
Before we go to cocktail chatter, I just want to encourage you to listen to another Slate podcast, How To. They have a fun episode on how to replace your Tesla. Tesla owners are dumping their vehicles in protest of Elon Musk, and that's driving down resale prices. And on the episode of How To I'm recommending, Courtney Martin talks with two soon-to-be former Tesla owners and with Patrick George, who's the editor of Inside EVs. And Patrick helps them figure out how to sell their Model Ys and how to find a car that aligns with their practical needs and I guess their ideological needs. So check out How To on how to replace your Tesla. So now let's go to cocktail chatter. Emily Bazelon, I don't think you have a Tesla to replace.
No Tesla. Bolt, Chevy Bolt, American car. Like that car. I don't want to be
It's a Bolt
in my car.
or a Volt or both?
I think
Volt.
it's a Bolt, although
No?
I'm often confused about that actually. But I'm pretty sure there are two, and one is with the B and one is with the V, and I think ours is the B, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, what are you, when you have your drink not in your Chevy Volt or Bolt, what will you be chattering about?
There's so many things to be wan and distressed about right now, and I'm sorry to raise another one, but the stories this week about millions of women in foreign countries losing access to contraception as a result of the Trump aid cuts is just so distressing to me that this is the effect on people's lives we're having elsewhere. There are hundreds of millions of dollars that are not going to help women get contraception all over the world, including shipments that are just like now going to sit in warehouses, might even be destroyed because there are no personnel to unload them and get them to where they were going. And, as we talked about last week, I was in Rwanda, and it was interesting to hear people's responses to the USAID cuts. There was some openness to, for a variety of reasons, some sense that like USAID, most of the money actually was going to the United States, not to Rwanda or other African countries, and some interest in reducing dependence. But over and over again, people said to us, like, it would be one thing if your country was doing this in a way where there was planning, where they were letting us figure out how to take over, especially in the public health realm, for something like contraception or disease prevention. Like that we could understand, but this very sudden, abrupt cutoff where so many resources are being wasted, and there's just this sense that the United States is entirely only thinking about its own very short-term financial interests. Like that is baffling to us. Why wasn't there some partnering with us about how to wind this down? Anyway, contraception is something, if you don't have it, then very soon there are consequences, and they are very much disproportionately borne by poor women. And bad.
John Dickerson, what are you chattering
Well,
about?
first a recommendation and then a chatter. You might think that the number of procedurals that I could recommend would have an upper limit based on the constraints of time and space, but it's not true.
I would not think that, based on knowing you for many years.
So I'm here to recommend, here he comes clumping down the road, Bodkin, which is on Netflix.
Oh my God.
And this is, it's got an Irish flair to it, and it's wonderful. And we just finished watching it and quite liked it. Okay.
I was with my college roommates this past weekend, John, and two of them are British procedural watchers, and oh my God, it was like being trapped in a room with you. It was.
Was
like
everybody?
They talked about Shetland,
Yes!
like the amount of discussion of Shetland, like not even the president of Shetland, not even the counselor of the Shetland Islands has ever talked about Shetland as much as they talked about Shetland.
We're going to Lurik. Anyway, I'm glad that you had that exposure to widen the aperture of your sensibilities. So, and then my chatter is actually this quirky thing, which it took me a few days to catch up with, but because of the onslaught of activity coming out of the Trump administration, it's been hard to follow. But the story starts back in February when the president hosted the nation's governors, and he got into a bit of a back and forth with Maine Governor Janet Mills over the president's executive order banning transgender women from sports. And he asked if the governor of Maine was going to comply. Governor Mills said no. He said, well, you're not going to receive any federal funds in your state. And she said, we'll see you in court. Soon afterwards, the acting director of Social Security, Leland Dudek, canceled 2 contracts that the Social Security Administration had with the state of Maine. And a staffer warned him that the terminations would result in both improper payments and the potential for identity theft. You may have noticed that there are wide claims being made by Elon Musk and the president about both improper payments and identity theft at the Social Security Administration. They have not been very good at coming up with actual evidence of that. But here you had the acting director, who was made acting director in the Trump term, being told, don't do this, don't cancel these contracts because it will lead to the things that you are supposedly trying to get rid of. And he replied, and this is from the email, please cancel the contracts. While our improper payments will go up and fraudsters may compromise identities, no money will go from the public trust to a petulant child, the petulant child in this case being the governor of Maine. Anyway, in the end, he admitted what he'd done, reversed the decision, apologized, and he's going to be replaced by the new director soon enough. But it does make me wonder what happens when you get rid of all of the people who've been fired or let go from, and this week HHS saw, I think it's a cumulative 20,000 in terms of fired and let go from the health services of the government. What is the operating software that gets replaced with either the new loyalists who are moved in or with just the people who remain? Like, what gets them out of bed in the morning? And if there's not something like public service or sense of duty to the taxpayers, does it get replaced with, our own just existing human frailties, which is, ego, spite, entrepreneurial cruelty? And is that rewarded? Which in this case, obviously, the Dudek either did this on his own or thought it would be thought well of by the president who had promised to punish the governor of Maine. What happens with all of the new operating system of the government? And is this an example of that, or is this an absolute aberration for which there will be no other example? My
chatter, contra you guys, fully cheerful. I want to talk about three items of culture that I have consumed recently that are wonderful. First, I don't think I mentioned that I did a Gabfest Reads a few weeks ago about a phenomenally good book. And so you should listen to my Gabfest Reads about the book Challenger by Adam Higginbotham, but mostly you should go get the book Challenger by Adam Higginbotham, which is a incredibly detailed account of the Challenger accident, how it came to be. He wrote the book Midnight in Chernobyl too, which was about the Chernobyl accident, similar book. And the Challenger book is totally gripping. So even though we all know what caused the Challenger accident, who died, how it happened, like we all know that. Like anyone who was alive at that time knows all those details. This book is revelatory. It's so exciting and tense and beautiful and disturbing, and it will make you think very differently about engineering, about space, about the United States in the 80s. Just really one of the best books I've read in years. So Challenger. That's number one. Number two, on my way to see my college roommates who talk about Shetland all the time, I had 2 bits of cultural consumption that were great. One is that I watched the movie The Intern, which I'd never seen, which is the Robert De Niro plays a 70-year-old widower who ends up as the intern at a high-flying internet startup that is run by Anne Hathaway. So delightful. What a great, delightful movie. I don't know if you guys ever saw it. So it's just like easy watch, but also like really moving movie. The Intern. Check it out. And more seriously, I read the book Emma, which I read obviously when I was much younger, but I hadn't read in probably 30 plus years, by Jane Austen.
Wait,
my God, that is a great book.
Wait, you just went, all the books that are out there, you were just like, oh, I think because I read too many books, I'm going to go back and read a Jane Austen.
Well, I had reread Pride and Prejudice maybe a year ago and loved that. And I thought, well, people love Emma, so let me reread Emma. I haven't read in a while. I'd actually started it, found it a slog because she's very unappealing for the first, 80 pages, 100 pages. She's a really unappealing character. And then the book just really, really takes off and is just funny and so psychologically astute. And
I hate
it feels just full of, her dialogue is so good. To imagine that someone had that good an ear for dialogue who lived 200 plus years ago it's humbling.
Your capacity to read is so far outpaces mine. It causes me absolute fibrillations of jealousy.
Your capacity to host network television so far outpaces mine.
Hey,
so
have either of you read Question 7, by the way, by Richard Flanagan?
No, is it good?
I mean, I'm reading it at the moment. I like it. I feel like I'm not sufficiently smart to catch all of the intersecting personal and historical threads that it weaves together. So I haven't quite finished it, but but I love what it does with memory. And so I like it, but I'm just like, I feel, I don't know, this doesn't happen with you two, damn it, but I feel slightly overmatched by the book. But I'm carrying on.
I'm reading This Is Happiness by Niall Williams, which is super Irish, and I think you might like it better than I like it, John.
Oh, excellent. I will put that on the list of books that I have here that you guys recommend that I still haven't gotten to.
And you cannot get to it, but Anne might get to it.
Listeners, you got to stuff. You emailed your chatters to us at gabfest@slate.com, and really appreciate it. Please keep them coming. Our listener chatter this week comes from Emma Wunsch in Lebanon, New Hampshire.
Hi, Gabfest. This is Emma Wunsch from Lebanon, New Hampshire. My chatter, as maple sugaring season winds down here in New England, is a story from the White River Valley Herald called Vermont's Mr. Maple Has Great Stories to Tell. The piece is about syrup expert Henry Macries, who spent 30 years with Vermont's Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets as a consumer protection chief. What I loved about the story is how it details Mr. Macries going undercover to bust maple syrup fraudsters and about getting sick more than once from bad syrup and inadvertently at the hands of his supervisor. Mr. Macries is in the North American Maple Hall of Fame and has tested syrup in all maple states and 4 Canadian provinces. I've always known that Vermont maple syrup was superior, but now I know why. Hint, it's about density and water weight.
That's all for our episode this week. We also have a bonus episode in your feed. Emily is going to talk to Ann Carney and Luke Broadwater of the New York Times about their new book, Madhouse, about how Congress has been warped and changed in recent years. So check out Emily's conversation in Slate Plus, but that's only for members. Members get bonus episodes at the Gabfest and other Slate podcasts. They get discounts to live shows. They never hit the paywall at the Slate site. So if you are a member, thank you. Gracias. If you are not a member, please subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's all for our show today. The Gabfest is produced by Kevin Bendis today. Our researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We will talk to you anon. That is next Thursday.
Today's episode is sponsored by Smart Travel, a new podcast from NerdWallet. I'm Sally French.
And I'm Megan Coyle. We're travel writers at NerdWallet, and we love helping you make your travel budget work smarter. Because who doesn't love more trips for less money?
People who hate fun, Megan, that's who.
But that's definitely not you, person who is listening to this right now.
On Smart Travel, we don't just hand out travel advice, we break it down. Like, should you get that fancy airline credit card with the huge sign-up bonus? Or is that just a shiny trap leading you to financial ruin?
We have the answers. The answer is, it depends, by the way.
That's why we do the research for you. We crunch the numbers, dissect the fine print, and make sense of loyalty programs so you don't accidentally spend all your hard-earned points on a sad airport hotel booked amidst a canceled flight.
Each week, we tackle real travel questions like, is travel insurance worth it? How do you spot a good flight deal before it's gone? And can you actually use those random miles your aunt gave you for Christmas? Also, I want that aunt.
Look, we don't just sit here and talk about travel. We live it. I once turned a canceled flight into a free trip to Denver, $200 in United vouchers, and $45 in Starbucks gift cards.
And you were so patient through it all. We've got practical tips, expert interviews, and plenty of hot takes.
I call them hot takeoffs.
To help you travel smarter, not harder. So whether you're planning your next getaway or just love staying ahead of the travel game, follow Smart Travel on your favorite podcast app.
Your passport will thank you, and so will your wallet.